thank you all for joining us at WonderCon at Home 2021 for the Changed in the Retelling panel. You maybe can tell from the panel description that I personally have been watching a fair amount of Food Network. In the same way that a chef can freshen a familiar dish with a new approach, so do these authors engage readers with their fresh perspectives on familiar or maybe not quite so familiar stories from around the globe. Alyssa Colman, The Gilded Girl, Genevieve Gornichec, The Witch's Heart, Nghi Vo, When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, and The Chosen and the Beautiful, Heather Walter, Malice, and Kiersten White, The Camelot Betrayal, discuss the ways their choices make these tried and true adventures more accessible and exciting for new readers. I will be the moderator for this. I'm Maryelizabeth Yturralde of Creating Conversations here in Southern California, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on each of our panelists, starting with Kiersten White. Kiersten is the New York Times bestselling author of The Guinevere Deception, The Camelot Betrayal, The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, the Slayer series, and many more novels. Her books have won several awards. She lives with her family near the ocean in San Diego, which in spite of its perfection, and for those of you who are not here today, I'm sorry, but it is a gorgeous, perfect day in Southern California as we record this, spurs her to dream of faraway places and even further away times. Some of the focus of this panel will be the first two volumes in the Camelot Rising trilogy, and we might also touch on her contribution to From a Certain Point of View, The Empire Strikes Back. Welcome, Kiersten. And Heather Walter. Heather is a native Southerner who hates the heat. But you had snow? Sorry.
I know. It was weird.
I'm like, ooh, such irony to the intro. A graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, she is both a former English teacher and a current librarian. Perhaps it's because she's surrounded by stories that she began writing them. At any given moment, you can find her plotting. Malice is her first novel, and it will be published in April. Nghi Vo is the author of the acclaimed novellas, The Empress of Salt and Fortune, and When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain. Born in Illinois, she now lives on the shores of Lake Michigan. She believes in the ritual of lipstick, the power of stories, and the right to change your mind. Her first novel, The Chosen and the Beautiful, is publishing in June. Welcome, Nghi. Genevieve Gornichec earned her degree in history from the Ohio State University, but she got as close to majoring in Vikings as she possibly could. Her study of the Norse myths and Icelandic sagas became her writing inspiration. She lives in Cleveland, Ohio. The Witch's Heart is her debut novel, and it released in February. Welcome, Genevieve. And Alyssa Colman. Alyssa won the 2013 Primary Stages ESPA New Play Competition and was a semifinalist at the Eugene O'Neill Theater National Playwrights Conference. She's participated as both a mentee and a mentor in the Author Mentor Match Program and is a member of SCBWI. She now lives in Los Angeles, where she enjoys making a mess in her kitchen and hiking with her family. The Gilded Girl releases in April. Welcome, Alyssa. So I'm going to have you all go in reverse alphabetical order, the way that I introduced you, if you don't mind, for this first contribution, which is tell a little bit about your spotlight title and how it fits the retelling theme of the panel. So Kiersten, that's you.
All right. So hi, I'm Kiersten. I'm the author of a new trilogy called the Camelot Rising Trilogy. Book 1, The Guinevere Deception, came out in 2019 and is available in paperback. And The Camelot Betrayal, which is book 2, came out in November. And book 3, The Excalibur Curse, will be out in December. So these are books that Most of my retellings start from two places. They start from a place of like deep love of the subject material, right? Like I love Arthurian legend, I love myths, I love adaptations of them, I love, you know, researching the history of the time period, all of those things. But also, as with my other retellings, they're triggered by anger. Basically, that this thing that I love so consistently has failed me in terms of providing dynamic stories and roles for women. Um, and there have been a lot of Arthurian adaptations that have done better and that have done a good job. But you know, traditionally and historically, the ones that I studied in college, the women are terrible. They just are. And I love Arthurian legends. They're so goofy. They're way weirder than what you think they are when you actually read them. Um, it's basically like Arthur's walking through a forest and he meets another knight and they're like, oh, well, I was walking through this forest first, so we better fight. So they fight for like 6 hours. And then at the end, they're both so tired, but they're still fighting. And they're like, you know what, bud? I think you're rad. I think we should be BFFs. And Arthur's like, oh my gosh, I think you're rad. We should totally be BFFs. And so then these people who were like mortal enemies are suddenly best friends and decide to join their armies instead of fighting each other and go fight somebody else instead. Which is fun, but you know, stories about swords aren't very interesting to me because a sword exists to kill people, right? A sword is a weapon. That's all it does. And so when I look at these stories and these tales of Camelot, I look at the women and I look at the stories that aren't being told and I look at the before and the after and all of these things that are going on in the background that Arthur doesn't notice because Arthur doesn't care, right? Like in the first story that introduced Guinevere as the queen, it was like, and then Arthur married so and so from such and such place, and then he went to another battle. And I was like, I want to see Camelot. I want to see the feminine Camelot. I want to see what the women are doing. I want to see the ways that they're navigating this new system of justice that, yeah, might be better than what was there before, but is so inherently masculine. And so that was where I got the idea for the Guinevere deception. I wanted to reclaim Guinevere. I wanted to make her a person with agency. I wanted to make her a source of both power and compassion within Camelot. And so it was a really fun series to write. I had come off of writing quite a bit darker things, some historical fiction that was tremendously research heavy. And so to get to create this very feminine Camelot that focused on the magic and the connections that women have with each other and the safe spaces that we can create when we work together was really a fun, nice place to escape to. And so yeah, I really hope that these books provide that same sense of recognition for people who read them, but also just escape into like some wonder and romance.
You say that, and yet I know you hurt people, but that's okay.
I do.
So speaking of hurting people, if you're writing, Heather, you're up.
Yeah, very true. So I'm Heather, and this is Malice, my debut novel. And it is a retelling of the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale told from the point of view of the villain. So the dark fairy, the evil fairy that we're used to. And it's very gay. So a lot of people are liking that aspect of it. The main ship is actually our Princess Aurora and the dark fairy herself. And I was drawn to write this book, like Kiersten was just talking about, because if you look at female villains, especially in fairy tales, their motives are so simple and boring, honestly, and very non-complex. They want to be the prettiest. They want to marry the prince. They want to steal the baby. They want to curse the baby. Like, this is nothing in these villains really kind of spoke to me. And I always noticed how male villains wanted to take over the world, or they wanted these big lofty goals, and no one questioned them about that. But the female villains, it was more just kind of like, oh, you want to be prettiest, like that makes a lot of sense. Yes. In the case of our dark fairy in the traditional Sleeping Beauty tale, we probably all know, or we may not, that she was not invited to a party, and so she shows up at the party anyway and cursed the host's infant child as a matter of revenge. And while we all understand the sting of rejection that comes with not being invited to that party, her actions are a little bit on the extreme side. And I think historically, extreme actions are often attributed to female characters like that, especially extreme petty actions. And so I wanted to create this villain who had more of a human side. And so our main character, Alice, is known as the Dark Grace in her realm, and she's the only one of her kind. All the rest of the Vila, which is what Alice is, have been wiped out in an ancient war. And so no one really knows where Alice came from or what she's doing there. All they know is that she has this evil power and they're all kind of afraid of her. But in Briar, where Alice and Princess Aurora live, magic is almost like a capitalist system where it's very much regulated by the ruling government and you can pay for it. And so the nobles of the realm are afraid of Alice and they shun Alice, but they also want Alice's power and they want Alice to use her power to exact revenge on their given people. So Alice is very much an outcast in her world, but she's also very much questioning where she comes from. And then she, in a kind of twist of fate, winds up meeting Princess Aurora, and she thinks Princess Aurora would be this shallow noble who is just like everybody else in Briar, but she's not. And Princess Aurora is actually already cursed by Alice's ancestors. And so Aurora wants to break her curse without the kiss of a prince, which is the only way that she can break it at the moment. And she wants to do it without the prince, and she wants Alice to help her. So it's kind of a twofold about why I wrote this story. Is one, I wanted a villain, a female villain, to have more of a complex motive, an understandable motive. Sometimes Alice might be a little bit more like ourselves than we might want to admit, the things that she does. And then I also wanted to give a little more dimension to that princess character, because in Sleeping Beauty, the princess sleeps. Like, it's right there in the title. Like, she grows up in complete isolation, which even as a child I thought was weird because she is the heir to the kingdom and she's never educated on what to do. They don't really make that big of a fanfare. She's either locked in the palace while they burn all the spindles, or she's off with the fairies while they burn all the spindles. And then they bring her in when she's 16 and they're like, okay, I guess now we'll start teaching you what to, like, she's really absent in her own fairy tale. And then she pricks her finger on the spindle, sleeps for whatever, and then wakes up with the kiss of the prince, and then is delighted to be woken by this stranger and to marry this person that she's never met. So I wanted to create this more dimensional villain with a little more believable motives, but I also wanted to create this princess who doesn't really want to have anything to do with being rescued or with being a prince, but she's also not this sword wielding hero, which is there's nothing wrong with a sword wielding princess at all. But I wanted someone that just a little more dimension, had a little bit more of a drive to do what she thought was best for her kingdom and for everyone else involved. So it's very feminist.
Thank you. Nghi, I think there's some resonance with some of those themes in yours, particularly the connection of wealth and magic. And want to take it from there?
Like so many advanced placement students who went through American public school, I was given The Great Gatsby when I was about 15 or so. And, you know, when I say given, I mean, it was thrown in my face and I had to be tested on it until, until I was kind of blue in the face there. And I loved it, actually. I loved it from the beginning. I loved it from my first reread. I loved it to my most recent one when I needed to research it to do my novel. And every reading that I've ever had, Jordan Baker doesn't make any sense. Her motives don't make sense. The things that she does don't make sense unless she is either evil or playing her own game. And that's kind of where I started for Chosen and the Beautiful. The fact that she is either evil, which a little maybe, but I wanted her motives to make sense. I wanted them to make sense with how she deals with Daisy, how her secret meetings with Gatsby go, which are in the novel. And then I added demons, and then I added a lot of drugs, and then I added some queer narratives and some immigration narratives. And, and then I just kind of went from there, and 4 months later I had a novel. So that's me.
I think Demon Prohibition may be one of my favorite. I never thought of it, but oh my gosh, why not?
It feels right? It feels right.
It does. Genevieve, so you're working in a universe that I think a lot of us know, but not necessarily with a protagonist a lot of us know.
Let me grab my book. Sorry, it's right here. Hello. Hi. So my novel is The Witch's Heart, It's a reimagining of Norse mythology from the point of view of the giantess Angerboda, who is only known to us from the myths as the mother of Hel, Fenrir, and the Midgard serpent Jormungand, by none other than Loki, who Loki's getting a lot of good press right now, thanks to Marvel. But I started writing her story because, like several of you, I was frustrated. I was frustrated that we have all of Norse mythology. And when you think about Norse mythology, you think about the women being like shield maidens and like doing all this awesome stuff. But there's so many goddesses that are just like name dropped and we don't know anything about them. So Angerboda is mentioned once in each of the Eddas, which are basically the two main sources from Norse mythology, which were written down about 200 years after the Viking Age ended. And I kind of explored her associations and like what she had in common with other female figures in the mythology who also don't get a lot of mention. And I ended up combining these figures to make one figure. But the problem then was that Norse mythology ends in the apocalypse. And we have here a woman whose children are heavily involved in that. And so like, I guess it's not a spoiler, but like two of them actually die in Ragnarok. But I mean, that's in the myth, so sorry about the spoiler. But so once I had all of these characters together as one character, I was like, okay, so I've given this one woman like phenomenal cosmic power. What kind of person would she have to be to not use that to affect the outcome of Ragnarok? So that was my whole angle. I wrote it in 3 weeks for NaNoWriMo in 2011 when I was in a Norse mythology course. A lot has changed since then, but that's the book.
Thank you. And Alyssa, let's talk about the Gilded Girl. And, you know, it contains certain spoilers, right? You know, if you know the little princess behind it, that, you know, one of the characters' dads is not going to survive.
Very true. Yes, lots of spoilers there. My book is The Gilded Girl. I don't have a book yet, but I have a postcard. And I also just announced recently that my second book is The Tarnished Garden. So the first book is a loose retelling of A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And the second book is a loose retelling of The Secret Garden, which is also by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So I'm very familiar with retellings right now. I always loved A Little Princess growing up. I watched the 1995 movie at basically every sleepover party. I remember vividly doing a passage from Sarah's downfall when she goes up to the attic, for the first time, as a passage from my middle school drama class. I just loved it. And then as an adult, I decided to get into audiobooks, and a lot of the classic audiobooks are free. So I went ahead and downloaded A Little Princess. As I was listening to it, I had a very different take on the book. For not only were there colonialism ideas that I had a lot of problems with in the original, but also I couldn't get over the fact that I thought Sarah Crewe was far too perfect. And I kept thinking she was this girl who did everything flawlessly. She was always kind. She never lost her temper. She went through this horrible experience, and yet I kept thinking, wow, she would have been awful to be at school with because she could just never live up to her. And that became the voice of Izzy, my servant character in the story. So the story is dual point of view between Emma, who is the new girl at Miss Posterity's Academy for Practical Magic, who arrives, and with her wonderful father, who is her whole family and her whole world. Emma has some struggles with her magic, but she can afford the education to learn magic. Izzy, on the other hand, is naturally talented with magic, but because magic is a privilege of the rich in this Gilded Age New York that I've written, Izzy is not allowed to learn magic and works as a servant at the school. So the two girls, their worlds collide when Emma loses her father and her fortune in a tragic accident and becomes a servant at Miss Posterity's Academy for Practical Magic, and the two girls decide that they're going to secretly get their magic together.
Which actually leads me into my next question, which is sort of talking about the tools of retelling. What sorts of choices did you make other than which protagonists you center? Do you make choices of voice? How else do you change the narrative? So do you want to sort of continue with that, Alyssa, and we'll go back the other way?
Sure. So I also kept thinking as I was writing with the two different girls, I wanted someone who was from the lower classes, who worked as a servant, who was not a part of this glistening Gilded Age world that she lived in every day, who wanted magic and she couldn't be it. And so the Becky character from the original just didn't work for my narrative. I wanted someone who saw through the gilding on the Gilded Age. So that was a struggle, actually, because I think that there's a lot of love for the original, and so I had to be careful to make sure that my book both reflects how much I love the story, but also I made it my own. So that was a big choice, to do the joint POV and have two characters speaking as a way of showing this is a different novel from the original.
I think you do that both in, having both of them have the same different responses, but to things like the idea that, like, well, it's great that the lower class, they don't kindle, they just get snuffed out. It's kinder for them. And both Izzy and Emma are like, I have questions.
Yeah, it definitely, I wanted to make sure also that Emma wasn't a horrible snob at the beginning of the book, because it would be hard to like and root for a character who completely was like, yes, the lower class should not have magic. So she does start out questioning, and obviously goes through a major internal change by the end of the novel.
Excellent. Genevieve, what tools did you employ?
I'm muted. I was muted. I kind of took an angle like this might sound bad, but I kind of took an angle like I was writing fan fiction almost. Like I was trying to respect my sources, and kind of fill in the blanks, because there's these huge, like, horrible gaps in the mythology. So I tried to fill them with things that would seem plausible and would respect my original source material. And even kind of tried to take, like, almost like a folkloric tone while I was telling the book, like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then here we are. So yeah, I tried to respect it as much as possible, but while still trying to make it my own.
Well, and I think little things like, so that's where Loki hung out while he was a pregnant mare, and who cleaned up the horse dung during that time? Well, now we know.
Yep.
So I think that was effective. Nghi.
I think I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of tools. I think the minute you have someone who is not the writer, or who differs enough from the writer of the original work, I think you're already operating a place where retelling is something that we all do naturally. The minute we have a narrative or a story that we love, we bring it into ourselves, we customize it to ourselves. I'm not unique in this. I was absolutely writing fanfic. I have already seen some of those accusations. And yeah, I was absolutely writing fanfic. I was given a story and I loved it, and it didn't work for me. So I was coming from the point of view of something that I had already decided was mine, and that I was enacting a very natural process, which is, this is mine. How do I make it suit me better? How do I make it suit my friends better, my loved ones better? And I mean, you could call that a tool if you want, but I really do think it's like the most natural thing that humans do, that storytellers do. So, and then I just put it down to words and made people edit it. So.
Excellent. All right, Heather.
There, unmute. So for me, when I wanted to tackle this retelling, I really used the why almost as a tool, I guess you could say, because one thing that struck me when I read every Sleeping Beauty tale I could get my hands on, and there's always only one dark or evil fairy, and I always questioned why. Like, why are there like apparently 500 good fairies who can all show up at the party, and then there's the one evil fairy? Like, why aren't there more of her? And so in my book, that there's like this whole backstory of histories and wars to explain why there is only Alice. And then when I'm getting into this whole history and backstory, that kind of like webbed outward to explain like what are even the good fairies and where did they come from, which led to how the magic system was developed and like the capitalism surrounding magic. And then with that why also came, why did the evil fairy curse this princess? Like, this is a very extreme reaction to not being invited to a party. So what is the real reason behind that? And when I started asking those whys, which then led to the what ifs, like you have this whole other book that came because of it. And so the why for me is very important in any story, but especially in a retelling. All
right, Kiersten, besides the fact that I've heard you talk about your lack of fondness for writing fight scenes sometimes, because don't you say fight scenes and romance scenes are awful similar because you have to figure out where everybody's hands go?
So many hands. Yep. Yeah, so I've written, I did a historical fiction retelling of the life of Vlad the Impaler, where I gender swapped him and made him Lada the Impaler. And then I also wrote a retelling of Frankenstein called The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. And because those two came from such specific sources, like, Vlad the Impaler was an actual person who did incredible and horrendous things. And Frankenstein source material is the one book, Frankenstein, and Mary Shelley. I did a tremendous amount of research, and I tried to be as faithful and as accurate in those retelling as I could while still telling a new story. And the nice thing about working with Arthurian legend is there literally isn't canon. So if you hear certain, directors saying they're going to do a faithful version of Arthur, there's no such thing. They actually think Arthurian legend is referencing, there's an account of a battle in Wales in the 5th century that mentions an Arthur, and they think that's what started it, but they're not even sure. Really what it was is somebody saw that and was like, I'm gonna write a poem about that dude. And somebody read that poem and they're like, loved that poem. I'm gonna write a poem. Somebody read that poem and they're like, awesome, gonna write an epic. This time there's a wizard. Somebody read that and they're like, oh, love it. What if we had more knights? Somebody read that. So all Arthurian legend ever has been is communal storytelling. It's been interacting and engaging with other people's ideas. So you have all of these like family trees that change depending on which version you're sourcing. Sometimes Mordred is his half-son / nephew. Sometimes Mordred isn't. Lancelot didn't even come in for several hundred years. There's this amazing side story with Lancelot who befriends a half giant, and they have like this incredible, very queer relationship where the half giant actually dies of heartbreak when somebody passes along a fake message that Lancelot was dead, and then Lancelot later is buried next to his half giant friend / lover. All of these amazing stories, but there are so many of them because it's always just been a communal storytelling. And so it was kind of a relief having come from such faithful and rigorous retellings to get to play in Arthuriana. And so I decided I was going to give myself a break this time because I started out and I was like, I'm going to reread Mallory. I'm going to read this. I'm going to research the crap out of 5th century England. I'm going to make it really, and then I was like, you know what? No, I'm going to take the archetypes. I'm going to take the noble king. I'm going to take the loyal knight. I'm going to take the compassionate, loving queen. And I'm just going to go from there. I'm going to take the things that I love about Arthuriana, those elements of the story that always capture my imagination. And then I'm just going to build my own mythology. I'm going to build my own Camelot because that's what Arthuriana has always been. And that's the joy of both reading and writing in Arthuriana, is that sort of freedom to just take the elements that you like and ignore the ones you don't. And if those stories don't have something you want to use yet, you just put it in, which is why I always joke that, Mallory is just as valid as Monty Python when it comes to Arthurian legends. They're whatever you want them to be. So that was the approach that I took with this particular retelling, which was very freeing and very fun.
So I'm feeling semi-clever because that's actually a great segue into my next question, which is sort of talking about, so as you're using materials, the pros and cons of using stories that people know and may know many different versions of. So for example, I'm gonna go ahead and jump to Alyssa only because I thought of this while looking at Gilded Girl, because I'm like, I know where this is going. And then I'm like, no, I don't, because that's not Little Princess, that's Secret Garden. And I don't always keep the two clear in my head. So pros and cons of building on known works.
I think for me, it was a process of trying to make sure that I kept enough of the novel that fans of the original would say, oh, I recognize this, while also making it completely my own. And, you know, a big thing for me was that I didn't want anyone to swoop in at the end and save my main character. I wanted both of them to have to save themselves. So for me, that meant doing away with the next door neighbor plot line, and the kindly gentleman who redoes the attic as if by magic. And I knew a lot of people were going to be angry about that, because a lot of people love that, and a lot of people love the movie where dad is right next door the whole time, and oh, amnesia, and that's not my story. So I know that there will be some people who are going to be furious at the changes I've made and say, oh, that was the critical element of the story and she took it out. Where there are other people who are going to say it was far too close to the original story. That was not enough. And I don't think you can ever please everyone. But I had to write the story that was right for me. And I think that I chose the elements of the story that worked, and I put aside the ones that didn't for the book.
All right, and to sort of jump around, Heather, what about you? You probably don't have a whole lot of retellings to choose from, but you still are going to have people who are like, that's not how Walt Disney did it.
Yeah, well, actually, like Sleeping Beauty is one of the most redone and retold fairy tales out there. People love to like do plays. There's the ballet, there are all of the movies, there's the Disney stuff, the Maleficent, there's all of that. And Maleficent, I always switch the C and the F when I want to call her Maleficent. She is one of like the villains. Like she's like canon at this point. She's such an icon. And so for me, that was a little bit of Alice is not her. Like Alice is a dark fairy. And so Alice needed to be herself while still appealing to those fans. But one of the pros for writing one of these retellings is that one of the commonalities of all of the retellings, at least that I've seen and read, it's like I was saying before, the princess is largely pretty helpless in almost all of the retellings. Like she grows up, she pricks her finger, she goes to sleep, she wakes up, she marries the prince, the end, like hooray. And in some of the early stories, actually, I was reading, it's very interesting. The curse doesn't even require a true love's kiss. It's like the dark fairy swoops in and is like, yeah, when she's 16, she's gonna prick her finger and sleep for 100 years. She does it. And then 100 years later, she wakes up and there's this like guy in her bedroom and she's like, we're gonna get married. And so that
she wakes up pregnant too, is my recollection.
Really? I have not read all of them. I need to find that one. That is very interesting. So yes. One of the pros of writing this is I just really wanted to take that princess and even the villain and just give them completely new life. Like, here you go, guys. Here is someone who does not just like get lured to a spindle and prick her finger and then is dependent on someone else to bring her out of this. Here's someone who is wholly independent and wants to do things her own way. And even with the villain, like this is not just this like inherently evil person who wants to do evil things all the time. Alice is kind of human, I hope. But one of the cons is when you're writing a villain, I have found sometimes people kind of want her to be the perfect villainess. Like she sees everything coming and she knows everything and she's not afraid of anything. And I feel like that airs a little bit too much with that same predictability that I was trying to avoid, because I mean, I am someone that I don't see everything in my life coming. Like I get blindsided by things all the time and things don't work out the way that I've planned for them. And I don't always know what I want. So I really wanted Alice to have that human quality to her. But that does mean that she's not that stereotypical villain that sometimes people love because they just love to watch people try to burn the world down, which is fine. I mean, that's great, but that's also not who Alice is.
So speaking of people we enjoy trying to be destructive or maybe just trickstery, Genevieve?
So working with Norse mythology was interesting because there's this appeal like that comes from like Marvel and like the history's Vikings and like this resurgence and like of interest in Vikings and the Norse mythology, Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology even like there's kind of a renewed interest in it. And there's also people like me who've read the sources really closely and kind of like know their stuff and maybe have studied it academically. And I kind of wanted my book to make sense to everybody like across the board. So if you I guess it was kind of like ambitious on my part to try to tell a story that ends in an apocalypse. Like the thing with Ragnarok is everybody dies at the end. Nobody gets away from it. So I've heard from my friends who are like into Norse mythology. They're like, you really went for it. Like you really like went for Ragnarok at the end. And then people who maybe aren't as familiar with Norse mythology are like, what do you mean everybody dies at the end? So it's kind of this it was like an interesting line to walk because I had to craft an ending that was satisfying even though the apocalypse happens. So I think maybe some people who like know the myths and like read my take on them are like Alyssa said, you can't please everybody. So yeah, I guess it depends on like how much you know and how much you're willing to forgive me for. And if you don't know anything about the myths, like I've also heard people say that like it made them want to know more and made them want to like study up on Norse mythology. I was like, that is so cool. Like that is goals right there. So yeah.
Excellent. Nghi, you're primarily working with Gatsby, but you've also worked with a lot of mythology. Maybe not mythology that is as well known to the average American fantasy reader as some of the European or Norse or even Greco-Roman mythology, but still mythology with a long history behind it. So how are you working with incorporating those elements?
I think that the pros and cons of working in any sort of retelling from any place of retelling something are about the same. Once you start opening up a story, it's fractal. You go in deeper and it just opens up more, and you go in deeper and it just opens up more. And depending on the kind of story you're kind of trying to tell, and a lot of retellings these days, we're specifically opening things up. We're looking at the guts. We're sort of like breaking it apart and seeing what happens when we put it back together. That's intimidating after a while. When I was doing for Chosen the Beautiful, there was so much research to get into. I mean, I think Great Gatsby is about between 42 and 48K long. My book is almost twice that, which was kind of a moment for me. I'm like, did I really need all this? And the answer was yes. To tell the story, I did. Yeah, I did. But the thing is, the deeper you go, the weirder and the more interesting it really does get. There's a throwaway line in The Great Gatsby where Daisy briefly mentions twilight sleep, something that happened to her when her daughter was born. And when I was given this story as a teenager, I had no idea what the twilight sleep was. I had no idea what it was until a few years ago when I learned more about the fact that women would be knocked unconscious with scopolamine while they were pregnant, and they would just be out for the whole pregnancy. They would wake up and there'd be a baby in their arms. And on one hand, this is painless childbirth, but as so many psychiatric texts tell us, the body remembers. They remembered being blindfolded, in somewhere in their minds, these women remembered being blindfolded and tied down in dark rooms. They did not understand why they were bruised when they woke up, because they were struggling against the bonds, and they had no idea. And that had a lot of consequences later on. And that really informed who I turned Daisy, how I wrote Daisy, which was a woman who had gone through that not so very long ago. And it explains a lot about her. So the further I think you go down into the research hole, the weirder and more interesting, and in some ways the more vital your narrative gets.
Excellent. And the better prepared you are to speak to people who either think you've done too much or done too little. Kiersten, you kind of started off on this, but anything to add?
I mean, yeah, anytime you're engaging with existing storytelling, I think the questions that you're asking are the most vital. Like, why are you personally retelling this? And it determines the way that you engage with the narrative. It determines what you do with it. But I think part of the fun and part of the value of doing retellings and why they are so popular is because people come with a base level understanding, right? Like you might not know all the Arthuriana, but you know who King Arthur is, right? You know who Lancelot is, you know who Guinevere is. So you're coming in with this base level of understanding. And then as a writer, you get to build on that, but you also get to subvert it because your readers are coming in already with these preformed ideas of who these characters are. And so getting to play with what they think is coming and subvert their ideas, like, oh, you thought this thing was one way. What if I, again, it's what Nghi was saying about opening it up. All of a sudden, when you look closer at it, you're like, oh, that's not at all what I thought that it was. And I think that's what's exciting about retellings, both as a reader and as a writer, is that subverting expectations, subverting the known, and creating new narratives and new ideas out of it.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to wrap up on this one, which is any Easter eggs that you've planted. Anybody done like, well, this is primarily a Robin Hood retelling, but oh, I stuck a Pokemon in. Anything like that that readers can watch for. And anyone who would like to may go first.
Again. There are a couple of very sly Monty Python references. I mean, these are serious books, but there is a joke about only needing a rabbit to attack someone. King Arthur's flag. This one I didn't do it on purpose, but I described King Arthur's crest and flag, and then I rewatched Monty Python, and I was like, oh, well, there it is. Yeah, some of these things implant so deeply you don't realize it. But another thing that I did that's a real world Easter egg is there's a magic system in the Camelot Rising trilogy that women use, and it's about tying knots, right? You can use bits of yourself and you sort of tie this magical intention and you bind it, right? So it's about creating protection and power in very finite, controlled ways. And I've gotten a lot of comments on that magic system because it is so specific. People asking if I made it up, and I didn't. It was inspired by the Malice which is a book that was written in the Middle Ages, and it was a witch hunter's Bible. It was used to persecute and murder women. It's an evil book. It's a stupid book. Like when you read it, you're like, this is just so stupid. But they used it to persecute women. And a lot of the things they would say is like, oh, well, if your horses aren't doing that well, go look up in your attic. And if you find any rope up there tied in knots, it's your neighbor, that independent woman who you don't like, who's cursing you and your horses. And it was always like, if you find knots in your cow's tail, or like, it was always about knots. And so I thought, well, the Malleus Maleficarum is stupid and evil, and it doesn't get to have that anymore. I'm reclaiming that on behalf of women, and I'm turning it into a very sort of traditionally feminine way that women would literally sew in protection and power to help the people around them that they love. So that's a way that I took something existing that I hated and turned it into something empowering and something that gave my women agency.
Fantastic. Anybody else? Alyssa, I had a moment of, I know what's going to happen, but it wasn't really an Easter egg. It was just, I knew, spoiler alert, that San Francisco in 1906 was perhaps not where someone wanted to be.
No, there's a lot of history Easter eggs in my book more than anything. I have a lot of Emma's father is killed, and you learn in the first chapter it's 1906 and he is headed to San Francisco. Not exactly the safest location at that time. So that's where she loses her father. But I also really enjoyed, because I got to play with a Gilded Age New York, putting in some Easter eggs of buildings and other, like the New York subway system opened the year before my book was set. So
Flatiron Building.
Yeah, the Flatiron Building is in there, which is fun because my publisher's Macmillan, so they all loved that. The New York Public Library on 42nd Street was being built, and Emma's father is a magitect. He builds buildings using magic. So it was really fun to take some of these buildings and then explain how they were actually built with magic that you don't know about.
Awesome. Me.
I have a couple. One of them is the fact that there is a paper cutting entertainment troupe that operates during The Chosen and the Beautiful. And they are, in my head, the beginning of what would eventually become the chop suey circuit in real life, a 1930s circuit of Chinese American performers who made the rounds, made the vaudeville rounds from basically New York to San Francisco. So there's that. There's also one line that I love and that I hope everyone looks out for, because I've already seen it quoted a few times in reviews, where Nick and Gatsby are chatting and Jordan's response is kind of a catty. It's like, "Are we having a gay time now?" And that's absolutely from the book. I was mostly not stealing lines direct, but I needed that one. If I was going to do this, there was no way I was going to let that one go by. So there's that.
Splendid. Heather or Genevieve? Yes.
I mostly just dropped like Viking Age material culture things in there. I started doing Viking reenactment or Viking Age living history like after I wrote the book. So in revisions, I just went back and like peppered in like little details like Hel makes these like knitted, it's called nullbinding, but she makes these mittens, and like there's like ceramic jugs and like gardening and like all kinds of stuff like from what I have learned. So like I've had a couple like fellow reenactors be like, "I see what you did there." So just
Nice.
stuff like that.
Nice. All right, Heather.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So with like most fairy tales, Malice has a bunch of other fairy tales kind of woven in. So you'll see some Cinderella type elements in there. You'll see a couple of like ugly stepsisters. I even threw in the Icarus myth, where there's a human that accidentally like makes a bargain for fake wings that they think are going to work, but then they melt and then they fall and they die. So I like to just kind of like throw in like other little fairy tales and stuff like that that reader might recognize. And I have had, this was not an intentional Easter egg, but I have had a few friends read Malice, and they keep commenting on the way that the magic system is regulated in Briar, where the crown controls how much magic costs and who can get it. And all of the graces the graces are the ones blessed by magic, and they have to record like exactly how much magic they expend and how much it takes them to make their elixirs and how much coin they take in. And there's like this ranking system of the houses and stuff like that. And I had a few friends be like, "This sounds oddly appropriate. Like if magic were real today, like this is exactly what would happen in our capitalist society." So not an intentional Easter egg, but also we could see it maybe. But the other fairy tales for sure.
Sure. Nope. I totally think that they are onto something there. So fantastic. Well, as mentioned earlier, all of our authors' books are either available or soon to be available and available for pre-order from Mysterious Galaxy or another bookstore near you, or from your library, because we love libraries too. So thank you so much to all the authors for joining us. Thank you to the WonderCon attendees for taking part in our WonderCon at Home panel. And I hope you all have vastly increased your to be read piles after this. Thanks so much.